So this builds on the first session, I think, but of course going in a particular direction, focusing on issues of religious diversity and religious identity. So I begin with really asking what do we mean by religious diversity? And the focus here is on religious rather than on diversity. Because the diversity that we're interested in is very noticeable, that both in terms of minorities' self-understanding, but also on how others see groups of minorities, that in most countries in Western Europe, and I think here in Belgium and Flanders, certainly in Britain and so on, we begin with national origins. People say, I'm Turk, or I'm Pakistani. Others say he's Indian, they're so-and-so. In Britain, we had that, but we also, as I'm sure you're all aware, had a very strong race identity as well. And so in Britain, we have, like in the United States, a very strong black identity. But what has obviously been very clear in the last few decades is the same groups of people. So we're not talking about new arrivals or new streams. The same groups of people who obviously don't have one identity only have come to project a different identity to the national origin one. And this has tended to be a religious identity. I mean, it could have been a linguistic identity, and there were questions asked about, the importance of language in the issues that I was raising about multiculturalism and nationalism to begin with, and I entirely agree. Those in Flanders are actually very important. This was pointed out to us by a number of people, and it was very apparent from the work that Orhan was sharing with us and so on in the earlier meetings that we had. But I don't have that competence to talk about language. Frank doesn't. And so we're obviously trying to contribute on the basis of our own work. And it's this religious identity that's become so prominent from minorities, which is now creating its own issues. So what do I mean by religious here? So I'm talking about identities, but also labels of how people are labeled, as I've already mentioned, which isn't the same thing. Identity is obviously more complex and deeper than just labels, but there have to be labels. We have to have words to talk about ourselves and talk about other peoples and so on. And so that's really the next point, that the identities I'm talking about are those that are felt by people themselves, but are also dependent on how others see them and to some extent make them. A point I think someone, I forget whether it was from the podium or in the discussion someone made, perhaps it was Orhan actually, when he said, of course, identities, minorities, are partly made by what the majority think of them. And that's absolutely right, and I build that into my idea of an ethnic identity or of an ethno-racial identity. People can't simply, socially and politically, assert an identity that others will not recognize. In fact, the multicultural struggle is often about the minority wanting to assert an identity and getting the majority to accept it. And that's good, I'm in favor of that, but it doesn't mean that one can take it for granted that it's happened or is happening and so on. And so the third term on the slide, racialization, is very relevant to the identities I'm talking about. I think especially in relation to Muslims, they're a group that have become racialized, not meaning that people have a biological explanation for why some women wear a headscarf or why some people say Allah Akbar, but rather a racialized identity is one that is imposed from the outside on a group that is homogenized, or as some people say, naturalized, hence the connection with race. But the other connection with race is the color divide. It's when white people create identities for people that they say are not white. They can be black, red, yellow, brown, but they're not white. So that's what I mean by racialization, this othering of a religious group. And now some people object to that. They said, hey, why are you mixing race and religion? These are two totally different things. I don't think they are. And insofar as I can point to historical precedent, in Europe we have a very good historical precedent, namely the Jews. A group of people who are supposed to be a race, an ethnic group, a nation, the bearers of a religion, etc., etc. That's exactly what I mean by ethno-religious. The next point I turn to, again, I think somebody raised this in a question they were asking when they said, what do we mean by religion? And I said, I'll wait till the next session, is that the minority religions are much more practice-centered than contemporary versions of Christianity, especially in Northwest Europe, but perhaps in Southern and Central Europe as well. So people say what they can and can't eat, what they can and can't do on certain days of the week, what they can and cannot wear, in ways that contemporary Europe has forgotten to associate with religion, because it used to be the case that Christians had various things as well, like, for instance, a rule about what couldn't be eaten on a Friday. I was actually at a conference in Oxford that was held in a Catholic institution, some kind of Dominican institution. And it was on a Friday, and they served us lunch, and I saw they were giving us beef. So I said, not fish on Friday? And it took them a while to understand what I was talking about. So that's Oxford Catholicism for you today. Whereas for minorities, public performance of their faith has an integral relationship to their faith, whereas for Christians, you don't even have to wear a cross, because it's all about how you think inside, what you feel, your relationship with something divine, something unseen. Whereas for Muslims, Hindus and Sikhs, and quite a lot of Jews, it's actually something about being seen as a Muslim or a Jew or a Sikh and so on. It's not just about a relationship with the unseen. And that means that one of the multiculturalist issues that all European countries, Western European countries, are facing, Flanders no less than the rest, are questions about institutional adaptation and accommodation in order to meet the practice-based faith requirements and the institutional norms and the wider culture of expectations about how things are done. Like, for instance, should halal food be served in schools or hospitals or in workplaces, canteens, and so on? This is a challenge for secularism because, especially if you have an interpretation of secularism which says religion is a private matter. Well, lots of minorities are saying back, no, it's not. Don't impose your conception of religion onto us. Rather, let us renegotiate the meaning of religion, private and public, because we now share this public space with you. Don't impose a notion of religion which is restrictive of our faith and our faith conscience. So that's how I get from, as it were, that's the transition from multiculturalism to secularism. Why it becomes an issue for the state, why religion becomes an issue for the state, as it were, all over again. Because many Europeans feel, well, this is history. We sorted this out ages ago. Why are we talking about secularism today? It's a non-issue. Well, the multiculturalist view is this is not a non-issue. This is a new frontier issue. So what about secularism? So I think, and I'm sure plenty of other people agree, that there are different modes of secularism. By secularism, I'm going to only talk about political secularism or state secularism, so I'm not going to talk about the secularism of private lives or communities or, how individuals live their lives. I'm talking about at policy, institutional, and lawmaking levels. I would say that there are at least these three modes of secularism. There could be more in what we call the West. Liberal secularism, which I'm very largely thinking of, and this is not just my own view, this is the standard political theory understanding, is very largely what they do in the United States. So there is a famous wall of separation, to use Thomas Jefferson's word, between the state and religion, or the First Amendment of the Constitution says, there shall be no establishment, and it promises religious freedom to everybody of all faiths, or at least of Christian faith they were probably thinking of at the time. So freedom of religion, but nothing at the state level. That is the understanding of liberal secularism. An alternative understanding is what I call Republican secularism, very much thinking about French laïcité, at least the laïcité of what you might call the Republican self-image, the ideological laïcité, because it's not necessarily actually what they do in France. Some wit has said that what they actually have in France is catho-laïcité, and I think they're right. When you actually look at their practice, it departs from their ideological image, or as another person has put it, the ruling philosophy of secularism in France tends to be support for Catholicism, laïcité for Muslims. But that's not the secularism I want to discuss here, because actually that is not the dominant secularism in Western Europe. In so many things, Britain has this idea of exceptionalism in Western Europe. You do your own thing, we do our own thing. But actually, in this respect, at least, we are part of the Western European mainstream, and it's France that is the outlier. Because the political secularism of Western Europe is what I call accommodative or moderate secularism. One that is about including religion, organized religion and so on, in a relationship with the state, rather than separating in an absolute way religion and state. And to give some content to what I mean, I have 5 features of what I mean by moderate secularism that I can go through very quickly. So one feature, in fact the central feature if you like, is that there's mutual collective autonomy between organized religion and the state. They are relatively, not absolutely, but relatively free to pursue their own logic, to pursue their own interest, to pursue their goals, whether they're state goals on the one hand or faith-based organized goals on the other. This isn't mutual exclusion, but nor is it one-sided control, which also is a form of secularism, but not this form. It's not moderate secularism. By one-sided control, I mean something like Turkey or even France, where the state controls religion. Of course, we have a number of examples in the world where it's the other way around as well, where religion controls the state. Perhaps Iran is a very good example. But that's not a secular country. So I'm not talking about one-sided secular state control. The second feature is that religion is understood as a public good. So we might all say that religion is a private good, meaning that for certain individuals it does them good, but it's up to them, and for other individuals it's not good for them, or they're indifferent to it or whatever. And of course we're probably thinking in particular about times of grief, times of personal distress, loss of loved ones and so on, where a lot of people say their faith gives them the strength to continue when they're completely devastated, especially at the moment when we're having especially in Britain, so many stories of loss of life and public grief taking place in London and other parts of Britain at the moment. A lot of people turn to their faith to give them the strength to continue. That's what I mean by a private good. But I'm saying that moderate secularism doesn't say that religion is just a private good. It says religion could be a public good through organized charitable activity. And churches are very much involved in the grief that I've just referred to taking place in London due to public horrors. A public good could be to do with education. Most of our foundations, higher education foundations in Western Europe have organized religious origins and so on. Or it can be something a little bit more intangible, like stable families. People say, there are some statistical correlations to suggest that people from a religious background or practicing a religion tend to have more stable family lives, which then is a public value, is a public good, whether you measure it in terms of public health or you measure it in terms of money spent on childcare or whatever. And some people even refer to issues around social capital, that religion is very good at generating social capital, a kind of Robert Putnam argument. So in all kinds of different ways, religion can be a public good. I'm not saying it always is, can be a public good. A third feature is the idea that this organizer of this public good, which obviously historically is the church or a church, belongs to the people, to the country, not just to its individual members. Now, that's an idea that so many of us in Western Europe take for granted, that actually it needs spelling out to realize that it's quite an unusual idea. If you go to the United States and you ask a church to do something for you, you ask a church pastor to marry you, for instance, they'll say, why? Who are you? Do you come to my congregation? Are you a member of my church? Whereas in England, if you go to a church vicar and said, oh, we'd like to get married, can you get your diary so you can enter at the date of our choice? They won't say, who are you? They'll say, yes, let me get my diary. Because if you're in this country and you'd like a church wedding, then the church is at your service. So there's moderate secularism. The idea is that the church serves the country. It serves the people of the country, not just its members. And this idea is taken even further in Denmark, where you have loads of atheists who say, if you ask them, what does it mean to be Danish? Amongst the top two things they'll mention is they'll say the national church, the Lutheran church. Moving on to the other two items of moderate secularism to give it some character. So here now we come to a fairly controversial one. Well, not that the others were uncontroversial, but this becomes even more controversial. The idea that it is legitimate for the state to be involved in bringing out the public good element, not just saying to the churches, go and do your own thing, but for the state to be involved in bringing out the public good element of organized religion. And I've got then in brackets, and not just protecting the public good from the dangers that organized religion can pose. Because what I have in brackets is relatively uncontroversial. Everyone will accept, especially in a continent that's known, decades and generations of religious wars, that the state has to stop religion being a public harm. And we have very, very recent scars from Northern Ireland in the United Kingdom. We know that the state has to stop religion doing its harm, but the point here is that the state may also do the opposite. It may work with organized religion, not just to prevent harm, but to promote the good. Like, for instance, to fund schools and so on, which I'll come to in a moment. But the final point, of course, is also very important, because moderate secularism is not just secularism per se, like as in the old Soviet Union or in China or something. We're talking about a secularism that accepts a framework of liberal democratic constitutionalism. So it's not that the state and the religion have to be completely apart, but rather whatever the relationship that they have, it must be consistent with the defense of individual rights, it must be consistent with democratic process, and it must be consistent with the Constitution. That's what I mean. But that's a very big set of conditions, but they're all background conditions. They're not part of the definition of any secularism, but they're part of what constitutes moderate secularism as its own form, its own mode of secularism. Before turning to Flanders, I want to consider two objections to the view that I've just put forward. Objections at the level of principle or theoretical argument, because those are important in the literature, but also because they help me to give more character to what I'm arguing for. So the first argument, and if any of you know the literature, you'll know this is a very strong position in especially Anglo-American political theory and liberal political theory, is they'd say that what I've just described is something that violates the liberal principle of neutrality. So I'll offer some response to that. Well, my first response is that if by neutrality we mean that there should be no kind of distinctive cultural character to any state, to any liberal state, that's an impossible condition. Because all states will have some character or another, and in fact, we've talked about, language and history and Flemish national character and so on. So I take it that's not needs to be rehearsed here. Another way of interpreting neutrality, an idea that comes from John Rawls's work. So in his later writings, he offered a slightly different take on what he meant when he said that the state must justify everything that it does in terms of public reason or public reasons. It must give a publicly acceptable reason for whatever it does or fails to do. And his definition of public reason was one that would be acceptable to all citizens without them having to refer to their fundamental beliefs. Well, and therefore, it's neutral between whatever your religion and your fundamental beliefs or lack of beliefs are. You're being given a public reason. And so this interpretation of neutrality puts the emphasis on the structure of justification rather than on cultural character or cultural historical character. My reservation about that, because I don't think that's acceptable either for what I want, is that there are serious problems, as people who've studied the concept of public reason have shown, about what is public reason, what counts as a public reason or reason with a capital R, because we often end up with this contrast between reason and faith, basically between rationality and non-rationality or irrationality. And I don't think that serves us at all well, because not only is it epistemologically difficult to make those kinds of arguments, but it tends to be divisive of society instead of inclusive. But of course, I've already mentioned the very big constraining condition of moderate secularism, namely the importance of liberal democratic constitutionalism, or LDC. So I do share a lot of common ground with liberal positions, because obviously this is a liberal position, but it's a much more minimal liberal position, which is mainly concerned about institutional norms and institutional frameworks, and doesn't offer some kind of epistemological or cognitive filter called public reason. It just says, yes, it's got to be done within this framework, but we're not going to glorify this framework by giving it a name of public reason. People may have their own reasons, and they may contest reasons, because this will be an ongoing matter of political discourse. Equally importantly, the next point is the importance of going beyond LDC. Because one of the problems with public reason is that it's too much seen as ruling things out. The state can't engage in certain projects because It has to be neutral. It has to justify itself by public reason. Whereas on my approach, we don't have to rule out most of the things that states do. I mean, if the state was genuinely neutral between people's different value systems, or their, what Rawls calls conceptions of the good, then, for instance, alleviating poverty. We all think states should be doing that, though we argue a lot about, exactly how and when and how much money should be spent and what's the time scale and so on. But everybody thinks that the state has some responsibility for alleviating poverty, perhaps excluding people like President Trump, but most people in Western Europe do anyway. But we can't justify that purely in state terms. We have to refer to conceptions of the social good or the public good or the human good in order to explain why we think our money should be taken away from us by force and spent alleviating poverty. Or funding blue skies research. So we're all academics here, hosted by the Royal Academy of Flanders. Of course, we all believe in loads of money being spent on research and science and blue sky stuff and so on. But lots of other people don't. But we say, this is a good thing. We don't simply say, we'll spend the money because it'll help you cure cancer. You don't want to die of cancer, do you? We also say, we'll spend money finding out how big the universe is. And that's a very expensive task that's going to take generations. And we're spending lots of money. But we think, hey, this is great. Wouldn't it be great to know these things? Because knowledge is a good thing. So we ask the state to do all sorts of things, fund opera, fund football, Olympics, and so on, because we think they are good things. So the idea that the neutral state says, oh, I'm not trying to do any good. Individuals, communities, churches, civil society, you go and do good. I just stand and make sure you don't break the law. That's a very emasculated notion of the state that doesn't fit Western Europe at all. Certainly doesn't fit Flanders or Belgium. And so that means, getting to the next point, is that I think that there can be a certain privileging of religion. But I immediately qualify it by saying, as long as it's done in a multiplex way. Multiplex, a term you may not have come across. I thought I'd made it up, actually, but then I saw that it does exist in the Oxford English Dictionary. It's a combination from multi, meaning obviously many, and from complex, the second half, as in like complex. So it's like variously, but complicatedly differently. So it doesn't mean that there's a standard measure of the good that Alleviating Poverty does, research on cancer, research on the meaning, or not meaning, the size of the universe, and opera, that all these things, they are privileged by the state because money spent on them, money forcibly taken from other people's pockets, who may not want to go to the opera or want to know what the size of the universe is, but we say, no, it's a good thing. We'll take some of your money and ask the state to spend doing that. That there isn't a single metric of justification. The justification is multiplex. And if it's multiplex, then many different things can be justified. And I want to argue that the things that moderate secularism does are part of this multiplex generation, plurality. One very standard argument is says, yes, but the big difference between religion and all these other things is the state mustn't tell you what to believe. Absolutely, I agree with that. And moderate secular states don't tell people what to believe. They just, if they privilege a church, they do it without requiring anyone to believe anything. Just as when they fund science, they don't say that the state believes in a particular scientific hypothesis. It believes in the scientific activity, not in a particular hypothesis. So the state supporting religion in various ways that it might do in charitable work or even in bishops in the House of Lords or whatever it is, isn't saying anyone has to believe anything. You know, atheists can share it and so on. And the final point I got here relating to diversity, which relates very much to the morning talk, is that this is an additive inclusivity which means that we should be equalizing upwards. Because again, one argument people say is, yes, it's so unfair that in countries like Britain, you've got the Church of England as an established state. Why should Muslims not also, why should they have to accept this? They're citizens. How do we equalize this? They say, let us disestablish the Church of England. I call that equalizing downwards. It's a bit like saying men have certain privileges that women don't, like maybe they earn more. I tell you what, let's take some money away from men, then women can't complain. They'll be earning exactly what men are earning. We don't normally say that. We do it the other way around. We say, let us get women's incomes up to the level of men. So I say that that's the principle of equality we should be looking at, equalizing upwards, not taking things away from people. Now, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to go even more quickly. I just want to say there are problems about negotiating privileging. I don't have all the answers, but just very quickly pointing to this complexity, because when we talk about something being privileged, it's a relative term, isn't it? This is privileged relative to that, which is, if you like, unprivileged. So I'm just saying, what is the comparison we're going to make? Is it religion relative to non-religion? Because that's how I personally came to this subject. So I was working on issues to do with racial equality and multiculturalism, then religion emerged. So I wasn't initially thinking about minority religions relative to Christianity. I was thinking about minority religious identities relative to, say, racial identities and racial equality discrimination laws, or sexual equality, or sexual orientation. So that's religion relative to non-religion. But then, obviously, there's the relationship between religion relative to no religion, people who say, I don't believe anything, or I believe in a secular worldview or something. And thirdly, one religion relative to another, like, Christianity to Islam and so on. That's very complex. I'm going to have to leave it out. Another objection that people make is they say this alienates Muslims. I haven't got time to go into it. It's in the paper, of course. But actually, no one's provided any evidence of any Muslim organization, certainly in Britain, but I don't know of any in Western Europe, that objects to state support of Christian churches. Muslims complain about their exclusion, not about Christian inclusion. Anyway, we could discuss that later if there's time. I'll leave that out. So finally, turning to religious education. So these are three multiculturalist principles that I derive from the discussion just now, but also the discussion in the morning. Schools should promote cross-cultural understanding and nurture inclusivity so all can develop a common sense of belonging. The presence of minority identities should be accommodated on an additive, not on a subtractive basis. The needs of minorities should not simply be understood in terms of majority preferences. I'll explain that more through my example. So then, actually specifically about what do I mean by religious education and what am I favoring and disfavoring. So my view is that there should be, and I offer this as a multiculturalist, moderate secularist view, there should be compulsory religious education in all schools following a national curriculum, just like any other school subject, geography, English literature, Flemish literature, and it should be in mixed classes. You don't have to separate people of Christians and Muslims and Jews out to teach this, in mixed classes. But in addition, not as a substitution, but in addition, there should be optional religious instruction, what I'm calling religious instruction or RI, for whoever wants it, even if the majority don't want it. So this is where I now bring in my principle 3, that one. This is where I bring it in, because I think we are heading to a position where this can become a realistic proposition. Supposing in Flanders or any place, Christians say, oh, we don't want any, this is less true in Flanders, but it is a position in Britain. A lot of Christian parents say, we don't need any religious instruction in our schools. Forget about it. Let's just get on with religious education, which I'm saying should be compulsory. But what if a minority puts its hand up and say, okay, the Christians have made their choice, but can we have some Muslim classes? Do the Christians turn around and say, no, you can't, because we don't want any Christian classes? Well, that's just majoritarianism. So the multiculturalist response is that minority preferences should be dependent upon minority needs, not upon a majoritarian Christian perspective or a majoritarian secularist perspective. And I say at the bottom, both are necessary and mutually balancing aspects of multiculturalism. So turning finally to Flanders and probably rushing through it, but Lenny kindly showed me her presentation, which actually has quite a lot of this in more detail, so it doesn't matter if I rush through it so much. But I'm in particular relying on those two texts by Lenny Franken and Patrick Lubick in 2012, and Lenny Franken very recently published journal article on religious education. I mean, in terms of overview, there's one very positive thing to say about Flanders. I mean, the recognition of 7 worldviews, constitutional recognition with state funding, especially in relation to faith schools, religious education in public schools, prisons, hospitals, military, salary payments for staff of certain faiths there, and up to 6 days off at school. This is quite unprecedented in Christian majority countries. This is very reminiscent of Muslim majority countries. So there's something about Flanders that's already got a certain Muslim character. So this is quite unusual. The kinds of countries that have up to 6 days off at school on the basis of your own faith as opposed to the faith of the majority are countries like Indonesia, Senegal, or India, which isn't a Muslim majority country, but has a larger Muslim population than half of Europe, taken as a whole. But there are some not so good features as well. Firstly, institutional assimilationism, meaning that the state will work with minority faiths, but it'll ask them to take a certain institutional character on, which basically reflects its working relationship with the Roman Catholic Church. So they have to organize into a single, hierarchically governed body, and so on. I think Lenny's got more to say about that. But I take it you understand the point anyway. The fact that all this financial support mainly ends up going to Catholic Church, especially in relation to schools, that's not a good thing from multiculturalist point of view, and certainly needs to be reviewed in the light of current demographic diversity. And something that someone raised this morning, the banning of things like the headscarf in school or for school teachers, that's obviously not something I recognize as multiculturalists. I have a number of theoretical differences with Lenny Franken and Patrick Lubick, but given where time is, I'll just leave that. It's in the text, you can read it. Perhaps you're probably more interested in the practical differences that I have with them. And in a way, it's a little bit embarrassing because I don't have a lot of practical differences with them. Nearly all my differences that they try and derive support for Flanders as well as a critique of the Flemish situation from a kind of liberal neutralist autonomy favoring point of view, when I think that point of view theoretically is flawed, and I try and derive it from my own multiculturalist, moderate, secularist point of view. I have noted, turning to the second point here, I've noted the Catholic Dialogue School, which was raised by one of the discussants this morning, also the active pluralism model and so on. I really don't think, and this is a view that Lenny and Patrick already have, I really don't think that one faith taking a dialogue model can achieve what Leeuwenberg offers as a goal for dialogue, namely that everybody becomes more self-reflexively rooted in their faith identity. It's just not possible to have a dialogue or a multi-logue in a condition where one party controls the dialogue to the extent that it does. And moreover, there's no indication that teachers are being trained to work in these sensitive, multilogical ways. And we clearly need to be thinking both in terms of training new teachers, you know, the next generation of teachers, but also in-service training for teachers in existing Catholic dialogue schools, and for that matter in the public state schools and so on. There is a problem about segregation and the public good, which is not mentioned by Lenny and Patrick, but I think is an issue. I mean, if they mentioned it, I missed it. And that is, it can't be right to have society overly divided. I've got to stop, right? So I'll stop at the end of this point. To have society segregated and divided. Dirk Jacobs mentioned that very strongly in the first session. And if it is the case that the policy of state funding of religious schools is exacerbating segregation, then that is a public harm that the state needs to consider, even though funding of state schools in general might be a public good. So I would suggest that you should be thinking in terms of requiring state-funded religious schools to show some good effort through outreach and so on, to show some good faith effort in trying to bring children, to enroll children into the school from other faiths. So in a Catholic school, it would be non-Catholics. In other schools, other faiths and the faith of the people running the school. I probably said most of the things that I wanted to say, so I think I can stop here. I certainly have to stop here. So thank you very much.